Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. These are the contents of Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Please pause the video if you'd like to get a closer look. Here is Paul Copan. We've shared his credentials in the previous videos for this book. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations by Paul Copan, we look at chapter 11, where we ask the question, does the Bible endorse polygamy, concubinage, and other related questions in the issue of bride price? Since the time of Thomas Jefferson, rumors have been swirling regarding Jefferson's fathering a child through his slave girl, Sally Hemings. During the 1990s, the discussion was ramped up, and President Jefferson was allegedly exposed as a hypocritical founding father. Further research, though, has shown that the likely culprit was Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph, who was at Monticello around the very time Hemings conceived, and who was known to spend time with the slaves. On the other hand, Thomas, who was 64 at this time, was battling severe health problems, including intense migraines. Randolph, Thomas's brother, though given to drunkenness, was in better health, and his character wasn't nearly as refined as Thomas's. Now, if Thomas Jefferson were the father of Sally Hemings' child, then so much the worse for him. And as having slaves, with conflicted feelings we should add, still wouldn't undermine the Declaration of Independence's affirmation that all humans are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The same is true in the Old Testament. Even if prominent Old Testament figures had more than one wife, or if they had concubines, this still doesn't overturn the standard of monogamy that begins the Bible in the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 24. But was polygamy legally permitted? Or did Israel's laws prohibit this practice, even if Elkanah, David, Solomon, and others disregarded the prohibition? In the ancient Near East, a married man could take a concubine, or second-class wife, when his situation was inconceivable. That is, if his first wife was presumed to be infertile, or even if she became sick. In such cases, it wasn't unusual for a man to take another wife to produce offspring. When we look at Israel's history, we see the influence of this practice fairly early on. The family was central, and having children was vital to carrying on the family memory. To be childless and therefore heirless was considered a tragedy and even a disgrace. So a second-tier wife was often brought in to remedy the situation. In the ancient Near East, polygamy was taken for granted and not officially prohibited. It was legally sanctioned in the Code of Hammurabi, which permitted the owner of a female slave, since she was property, to utilize her for sexual and reproductive powers to bear children. If the slave bare children, she could go free on the death of her master. The earliest reference to polygamy, otherwise known as bigamy, in the Old Testament is the not-so-nice Lamech, who takes two wives. The first of over 30 references to polygamy in the Old Testament. Later on in Genesis, Abraham couldn't produce a child with his wife Sarah, so Sarah gave Abraham her servant Hagar as a quote-unquote wife, and Ishmael came as a child between Abraham and Hagar as a result. Ishmael's birth produced a conflict between Sarah and Hagar, with Abraham in the middle of it all. So this polygamy, instead of it being endorsed Bible's clearly showing the polygamy that's being allowed to occur because of people's hard hearts. It created more conflict. The Bible's painting that picture, that it wasn't looked at as a blessing, it was looked at as a curse. So Hagar had apparently won this game of one-upmanship until Sarah sent her away. We'll look at the Sarah-Hagar story when we get to slavery in the New Testament. The same problems came to Jacob. Through trickery, Jacob ended up with 2 wives instead of 1. When Rachel and Leah had realized they were infertile, in desperation they gave Jacob their handmaids in hope of producing children in this honor-shame competition. One of these handmaids, Bilhah, is called both concubine and one of Jacob's wives, a second-string wife. So there was apparently something official in this arrangement, even though the handmaids were second-tier wives. Concubines, at times, were simply second-tier wives, though still officially married. A concubine can refer to a second wife who comes after the first one has died. For example, after Sarah died, widower Abraham took another wife, Keturah. 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 32 refers to Keturah as a concubine, Hebrew word pilgesh, but this term can be used of a legitimate wife, just not the original wife of a man. Even the concubine mentioned in Judges 19 was not a mistress. The concubine mentioned in Judges 19 was considered married to a husband, according to verse 3 of Judges chapter 19. The text uses father-in-law and son-in-law to indicate genuine marital status. You can pause the video at this time and look up the scripture in Judges chapter 19 to check these references if you are so inclined. While polygamous marriages, including concubines, occurred in the Old Testament without God's stamp of approval, keep in mind that such marriages still brought with them a husband's commitment to protect and provide for his wife. By contrast, if a child came through a woman hired for sexual pleasure, this brought shame and no inheritance. For example, in Judges chapter 11, you have Jephthah. When it came to Israel's rulers, political maneuvering, not simply sexual pleasure, was often involved in taking concubines. Things eventually get ridiculous when Solomon, having 700 wives and 300 concubines, according to 1 Kings chapter 11, often taken from other nations for purposes of political alliances. Yeah, Solomon got his wives from other nations, wives and concubines from other nations for the purposes of political alliances. Yet Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, strictly warned that Israel's future kings shouldn't multiply wives, or else the king's heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold, nor shall he accumulate horses. If he got too many wives, they would steal his heart away from God. And of course, that's what Solomon did, and that was Solomon's downfall. In 1 Kings, the biblical narrator uses irony to denounce Solomon's leadership and spiritual qualifications. From the very start of Solomon's reign, Solomon violated all of these prohibitions. He took too many wives for himself. He took too much material wealth, silver and gold, for himself. He took too many horses. Solomon violated all these prohibitions. First, he married Pharaoh's daughter and other foreign wives, and he let those foreign wives lead his heart away from the Lord. Solomon accumulated too many chariot horses. Solomon hoarded silver and gold. Solomon made an alliance with Egypt through marriage. Solomon was a tyrant also, according to his son Rehoboam, Solomon put a heavy yoke on Israel and scourged Israel with whips. Solomon's disobedience and heavy-handedness eventually led to Israel's divided kingdom. Solomon squandered the potential and the gifts God had given him. Solomon failed to meet God's conditions. If Solomon obeyed God, God would establish Solomon's kingdom. If Solomon worshipped false gods, Israel would be cut off from the land that God had given them. The appointed moral spiritual example in Israel failed spectacularly, especially in the area of marriage. So, let's look at some passages and see whether or not they endorse polygamy. There's the joke, I treat both my wives equally. Isn't that bigamy? We see a good deal of bigamy, people having 2 wives in the Old Testament. And it's not unusual to hear critics say, based on Old Testament texts, that God actually endorses polygamy or bigamy. However, if God commended or commanded bigamy or polygamy, this would be a derivation from the assumed standard of heterosexual monogamy in Genesis chapter 2. We will look at several key texts on this topic. With there being no polygamy, we can look at Leviticus chapter 18 verse 18, we can also look at a passage from Exodus 21, from 2 Samuel 12, from the unloved wife in Deuteronomy 21. So let's look at whether or not polygamy is endorsed in Leviticus 18. An excellent case can be made that Leviticus 18 verse 18 prohibits polygamy. Quote, "Nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive." The text literally means a woman to her sister. The NIV translates it, "Do not take your wife's sister," literally a woman to her sister, as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. This text is regularly overlooked in discussions of polygamy in the Old Testament. Part of the reason for this oversight is where the verse happens to be found. This verse's significance is obscured because it's preceded by various anti-incest laws. We'll see, however, that Leviticus 18:18 is a transitional verse and shouldn't be included in the anti-incest section. A major break occurs between verses 17 and 18. Each verse in verses 7 through 17 begins identically, starting with the noun, the nakedness of Hebrew word urwat, and it leads up to the command, "You shall not uncover so-and-so's nakedness." Also, in each of these verses, except verse 9, an explanation is given for the prohibition. Either, for example, one explanation would be that she is your mother. This explanation isn't found in verse 18, in which we would expect if it were an incest prohibition. By contrast, each verse in verses 18 through 23 begins with a different construction. Even if you don't read Hebrew, you can truly just glance at the text and immediately see the difference in structure, starting with verse 18. Verses 18 through 23 begin with what's called the wa conjunctive, like our word and, followed by a different word than nakedness, Hebrew word urwat. Also, instead of the consistent use of the negative lo plus the verb uncover, tegela, from the root gela, as in verses 7 to 17, here the negative particles are used before verbs other than uncover. Why are these contrasts important? In verses 6 to 17, we're dealing with kinship bonds, while verses 18 through 23 address prohibited sexual relations outside of kinship bonds. Furthermore, the key word in chapter 18, verse 18 is serar, that is, to make a rival wife. The same word in noun form, Sarah, is also found in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 6, the story of Elkanah and his wife Hannah and the rival wife Peninnah. Hannah and Peninnah were not biological sisters, just two female Israelite citizens or sisters. This fits what we find in the non-kinship section of Leviticus chapter 18. So this law in chapter 18, verse 18 of Leviticus then explicitly prohibits the taking of a second rival wife in addition to the first. The interpretation taken by the Quran, the Dead Sea Scrolls community established in the 2nd century BC. One final point here. The wording in chapter 18, verse 18, literally, a woman to her sister, itself indicates that this is not a literal sister. This phrase, a woman to her sister, and its counterpart, a man to his brother, are used 20 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and never do they refer to a literal sister or brother. Rather, they're idioms for one in addition to another. So this verse doesn't refer to incest. Rather, it refers to the addition of another wife to the first, or polygamy. What then about the other instances in Scripture that seem to endorse polygamy? God forbids it in Leviticus 18:18, yet people practiced it in Israel. Of course, the same could be said about many prohibited practices, such as idolatry, such as infant sacrifice, oppressing the poor, and so on. Yet some will argue that polygamy is implied or even divinely encouraged in certain passages. So let's explore some of these texts. Let's look at Exodus chapter 21, verse 7 through 11, the servant girl as prospective wife. And here we see in that passage that if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, or if he refuses to go with the possible engagement, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he's dealt deceitfully with her. And if he's betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food or clothing and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. As we've seen earlier, this is another example of case law. Such regulations don't assume that the described state of affairs are ideal. They don't endorse the state of affairs. Case law begins with the specific examples that don't necessarily present best case scenarios. So just because it gives an example of something, it doesn't mean that it endorses that thing. if two men quarrel or if someone strikes a man are examples of case law. So the law here instructs Israelites about what should be done under certain inferior conditions. If a man sells his daughter, it doesn't mean that selling his daughter is something that he should do, but it's just describing what should be done if that happens. But we'll see that even if conditions are less than ideal, the goal is to protect women in unfortunate circumstances. Later on, we'll come back to this passage in the context of Israelite slavery. We're left to wonder what kind of father would sell his daughter. Actually, when a father sells his daughter, he's doing so out of economic desperation, as we'll see later on in the chapters on servanthood, which is more like a contracted employment. In fact, so slavery was not slavery like the New Atheist claim. It's not like you think of in the antebellum South. It's contracted employment. In fact, the father is doing this out of concern for his family, and Israel's laws provided a safety net for its very poorest. Voluntary selling was a matter of survival in harsh financial circumstances. Temporarily contracting out your family members to employers who also provided room and board was the most suitable alternative during hard times. Safety nets shouldn't become hammocks, and a typical servant tried to work off the terms of his contract and become debt-free. As far as a marriageable daughter goes, the father would do his best to care for her as well. Here, he's trying to help his daughter find security in marriage. The father would arrange for a man with means to marry her. Some people will argue, look, the man has a son, therefore he must be married, and so he's looking into the possibility of getting a second wife, maybe to produce children if his first wife is barren. So we have implicit support of polygamy here, don't we? This conclusion is too quick, however. It goes beyond the evidence. Two obvious options present themselves. The man's first wife has died, or the man and his first wife divorced. Let's not forget that the son was of marriageable age, typically in his 20s, as was the girl. So whether the man takes his young servant woman to be his wife or the wife of his son, we still have no polygamy here either way. Furthermore, this passage involves some issues in translation. The Hebrew text, verse 8, indicates that the man decides not to take the servant girl as his wife. In verses 9 and 10, two other possibilities arise. The man, whether widowed or divorced, might give her to his son. And this is the tricky part. He marries another woman. Some suggest that this is an endorsement of polygamy. The man takes a servant girl and marries another woman in addition, but this is a misreading. We're already told in verse 8 that the man doesn't choose to take a servant woman as his wife. In that case, we should understand verse 10 to mean that he marries another instead of the servant woman. Then what are the marital rights the man owes her? Doesn't this also sound like polygamy here? The problem with the translation marital rights, ona, is this. It's a stab in the dark with the term only used once in the Old Testament. Words occurring only once can often be tricky to handle, and translators should tread carefully. Some scholars here have suggested more likely possibilities. For example, this word could be related to a word for oil or possibly ointments. The servant girl should be sent out with three basic necessities: food, clothing, and oil. However, an even more plausible rendering is available. The root of the word is associated with the idea of habitation or dwelling, meon or meona. For example, God is a dwelling place, or heaven is God's holy dwelling place. We can more confidently conclude that quarters or shelter, though possibly oil, are in view here, not conjugal rights. So the servant girl should be guaranteed the basic necessities: food, clothing, lodging, and shelter. So we're not even talking about polygamy here, let alone some implied support of it. To review, the three issues here are: first, if the man rejects a servant woman as his wife, she's to be given her freedom, redeemed or brought back. Second, if the son wants to marry her, she's to be taken in as a family member and treated as a daughter. Third, if the man marries another woman, the servant woman is to receive food, clothing, and lodging. Although we'll touch on this passage again in light of Deuteronomy 15, Copan thinks we can set aside the polygamy question as far as Exodus 21 is concerned. Now we'll look at David in 2 Samuel 12, verse 8, and see if that endorses polygamy. Allegedly, God's own commentary here, through Nathan the prophet, suggests endorsement of polygamy. After David's power rape of Bathsheba and the murder of Bathsheba's husband Uriah, God tells David, "I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things than these." Isn't God graciously providing multiple wives for David in this passage? We should be careful about reading too much into the word gave. After all, the same word is used in 2 Samuel 12:11, where it says, "Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I'll take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun." Certainly, God didn't demonstrate his approval of polygamy by giving David's wives over to his treacherous son Absalom. Furthermore, the master mentioned in chapter 12, verse 8 is Saul. A sentence indicating that God gave Saul's house and wives to David is probably a general reference to the transfer of Saul's estate to the new monarch, David. David took Saul's wife, Ahinoam, to be his own. This would be a violation of Levitical law. Ahinoam was the mother of Michal, whom Saul gave to David as a wife, and Leviticus 18, chapter 18, verse 17 forbids marrying one's mother-in-law. So this passage hardly lends support to God's endorsement of polygamy. What about the unloved wife in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17? And here we see a man that has two wives. He loves one, not the other, and both have given him children. The loved wife and the unloved wife have given the man children. If the firstborn son of the unloved wife, it shall be on the day that he bequeaths his possessions to his sons, that he must not bestow the firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved wife, the true firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him, the son of the unloved wife, a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. So what does this legislation do? This legislation protects against favoritism. The firstborn's inheritance shouldn't be withdrawn just because his mother happens to be the unfavored wife. The firstborn's inheritance shouldn't be withdrawn just because his mother happens to be the unfavored wife. Does this passage slyly endorse polygamy? Not at all. If a man has two wives is an example of case law. It doesn't necessarily endorse a practice, but gives guidance for when a particular situation arises, or when a particular situation is practiced. For example, Exodus 22:1 says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. This law isn't advocating stealing. It offers guidance in unfortunate circumstances, namely when a theft takes place. Similarly, in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is questioned about Deuteronomy 24:1, which begins, when or if a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and he puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. Jesus tells his questioners that Moses didn't command this legislation, which was to protect a divorced woman from the whim of her husband, who later decides he wants her back. Rather, Moses permitted this legislation because of human hard-heartedness. Also, some scholars suggest that Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 to 17 doesn't state that both wives are living in the same house. The verb of the form has suggests that the man may have remarried after his first wife had died. Let's try to wrap up the polygamy question by summarizing the appropriate response to polygamy in the Old Testament. First, the Old Testament makes clear the ideal was built into creation. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, note the singular wife as well as father and mother. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18, we have the expression of strong disapproval for polygamy, even if this law wasn't always carried out. So the biblical writers hoped for better behavior, but because of human hearts that were sinful, they didn't get that better behavior all the time. Some scholars have suggested that polygamy may have been tolerated for the practical reason that its prohibition would have been difficult to enforce. From Lamech's wives to those of Abraham, Esau, Jacob, David, and Solomon, wherever we see God's ideal of monogamy ignored, we witness strife, competition, and disharmony. So we see God permitting man to have his choice, man or woman have his or her choice, and we see that when man or woman has his or her choice, we see the results. We see strife, competition, and disharmony, and from that, were to draw the practical application that when God's ideal is not followed, that leads to bad things happening, and when God's ideal is followed, that leads to good things happening. In general, the Old Testament presents polygamy as not only undesirable, but also a violation of God's standards. Old Testament narratives subtly critique this marital arrangement. God warns the one most likely to be polygamous, Israel's king. He says the king shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. And again, that's exactly what happened to Solomon. God himself models covenant love for his people. This ideal union of marital faithfulness between husband and wife is one without competition. And that's what God wanted for himself with Israel. And they ultimately rejected him, crucified their Messiah. And now you see Jesus, he models the covenant love for his people. He lives and dies and rises again, and those who repent and put their faith in him become his covenant people, the church. So the advice of Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 to 18 is the presumed standard. A man should find delight and sexual satisfaction with his wife in a monogamous marriage. Drink fresh water from your own well, it says. Now we're going to look at the bride price. The idea of bride price is presented by the new atheists as though it is a matter of buying a wife like you would buy a horse or a mule. In actual fact, the bride price was the way a man showed his serious intentions toward his bride-to-be, and it was a way of bringing two families together to discuss a serious, holy, and lifelong matter. Having sex with a young woman without the necessary preparations and formal ceremony cheapened the woman and sexuality. The process of surrounding the bride price reflected the honorable state of marriage. Think of the dowry system used in places like India. In this case, the family of the bride-to-be gives money to the future husband's family. Such a transaction hardly means that the groom-to-be is mere property. Why automatically conclude that the woman is property because this marriage gift is given in the Old Testament, but that a man isn't property under the dowry system? The bride price was more like a deposit from the groom's father to the bride's father. The Hebrew word deposit, mohar, is better translated marriage gift. It not only helped create a closer family tie between the groom's family and the bride's family, but also provided economic stability for the marriage. So the bride price was actually to help the marriage. The gift given to the bride's father, often several years' worth of wages, compensated him for the work that his daughter would have otherwise contributed to the family that she was leaving. The marriage gift, preserved by the husband throughout the marriage, also served as a security for the wife in the case of divorce or her husband's death. In fact, the bride's father would often give an even larger gift of property when the couple was married. Christopher Hitchens' complaint about the Old Testament bride price is misguided. What about rape? Was rape allowed? Some critics say that the law of Moses permits the rape of women, or may condemn rape, but with little concern for the victim's well-being. We should note two related passages. The first is Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 and 17. If a man entices, the Hebrew word for entices is pata, a virgin who is not betrothed, and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. Extending and expanding on the discussion of Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 22, which can be divided into three portions, reads this way. First portion, if a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry out the city, and the man because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away the evil from among you. Part 2. But if a man finds a betrothed young woman in the countryside, and the man forces her and lies with her, then the only man who lay with her shall die. Then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman here. There is in the young man no sin deserving death. For just as when a man rises against his neighbor and kills him, even so is this matter. For if he found her in the countryside, and the betrothed young woman cried out, but there was no one to save her. Part 3. If a young man finds a young woman who's a virgin, who's not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he's humbled her. He shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days. Upon closer inspection, the context emphasizes the protection of women, not the insignificance of women, like the new atheists might claim. God is a God who's trying to protect people. New atheists don't want to see that. We should first distinguish among the three scenarios that in the Deuteronomy 22 passage. The first scenario is adultery between two consenting adults. A man and an engaged woman in verse 23, which is a violation of marriage. He had violated his neighbor's wife. The second scenario is forcible rape of an engaged woman in verse 25, whose innocence is assumed. The third scenario is the seduction of an unengaged woman and the expansion on the seduction passage in Exodus 22. In each case, the man is guilty. However, the critic's argument focuses on verses 28 and 29, where the rape victim is being treated like she's her father's property. She's been violated, and the rapist gets off by paying a bridal fee. No concern is shown for the girl at all. In fact, she's apparently forced to marry the man who raped her. Are these charges warranted? Regarding verses 28 and 29, various scholars see Exodus 22, 16 to 17 as the backdrop to this scenario. Both passages are variations in the same theme. Even if there's some pressure from the man, the young woman is complicit. Though initially pressured or seduced, she doesn't act against her will. The text says they are discovered, not he is discovered. Both the man and the woman are culpable. Technically, this pressure or seduction could not be called forcible rape, falling under our contemporary category of statutory rape. Though the woman gave in, the man would bear the brunt of the responsibility. As it would have been more difficult for a woman to find a husband, had she been sexually involved with another before marriage, her bride price, a kind of economic security for her future, would have been in jeopardy. The man guilty of statutory rape seduced the unengaged woman. He wasn't a dark alley rapist whom the young woman tried to fight off, or whom she tried to run away from. This passage is far from being demeaning to women. Both passages suggest two courses of action. First, if the father and daughter agree to it, the seducer must marry the woman and provide for her all her life without the possibility of divorce. The father, in conjunction with the daughter, has the final say-so in the arrangement. The girl isn't required to marry the seducer. The second course of action, the girl's father, the legal point person, has the right to refuse any such permanent arrangement, as well as the right to demand the payment that would be given for a bride, even though the seducer doesn't marry his daughter since she's been sexually compromised. Marriage to another man would be difficult, if not impossible. The girl has to agree with this arrangement, and she isn't required to marry the seducer. In this arrangement, she is still treated as a virgin. Again, we don't see a lack of concern for the woman. Her well-being is actually the underlying theme of this legislation. Are women prisoners of war as war booty? How amazing it would be to live in a war-free world. Although lately many Western democracies have been fairly free from the traumas and devastation of war, warfare in the ancient Near East was a way of life. We'll say more on this in future chapters. War brought with it certain unavoidable realities in the ancient world, and the ancient Near Eastern peoples had different ways of minimizing the effects of war. One concern was prisoners of war. In the wake of battle, the problem arose. What was to be done with survivors? Let's look at two texts that deal with foreign prisoners of war, Deuteronomy 20 and 21. We'll deal with them in reverse order. So in Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14, the Lord delivers prisoners of war into Israelite hand. You see a beautiful woman and you want to marry her. You bring her home, you have her shave her head and trim her nails. She mourns her father and mother, and then after a month you can be her husband, and if you don't delight in her, you can set her free. But you shouldn't treat her brutally. So in this scenario, the law served as a protective measure for the woman prisoner of war. She was the one who benefited from this legislation. The woman prisoner of war benefited from the legislation. The law defended the woman's rights and personhood. For one thing, the woman wasn't raped, which was a common practice in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The would-be Israelite husband couldn't simply marry, let alone have sex with her immediately. No, she was to be treated as a full-fledged wife. Unlike many Las Vegas weddings or the phenomenon of mail-order brides, the matter of marriage in Israel was not entered into lightly. It was not motivated by lust. That point is strongly reinforced in this passage. The separation process allowed for a period of reflection. Before a woman prisoner of war was taken as a wife by the victorious Israelite soldier, she was allowed a transition period to make an outer break and an inner break from her past way of life. Only after this could she be taken as a wife. Given the seriousness of marital commitment, the time period allowed for the man to change his mind. The line, "if you're not pleased with her," doesn't suggest something trivial, however, since the Mosaic law took seriously the sanctity of marriage. If for some reason the man's attitude changed, the woman had to be set free. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 13 and 14. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, you shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword, but the women, the little ones, the livestock, and all that's in the city, all the spoil, you shall plunder for yourself, and you shall eat the enemy's plunder, which the Lord your God gives you. Copan will discuss warfare later. For now, the concern is the well-being of captured women and children. Although rape was a common feature in ancient Near Eastern warfare, Israelite soldiers were prohibited from raping women, contrary to what some crassly argue. Sex was permitted only within the bounds of a marital commitment, a repeated theme laid out under Mosaic law. So, rape was not encouraged. Rape in warfare was not a grand exception to the requirement of sexual fidelity. As with Deuteronomy 21, the scenario here is the same, namely a soldier's taking a wife. Rather than being outcasts or the low woman on the totem pole, women captured in war could become integrated into Israelite society through marriage. Understandably, it was far less likely that men would have been as readily integrated into Israel's life and ways. Deuteronomy 25, an offhanded excursus. Verses 11 and 12 of Deuteronomy 25 say, if two men fight together and the wife of one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of the one attacking him and puts out her hand and seizes him by the genitals, then you shall cut off her hand and your eye shall not pity her. This passage refers to the immodest lady wrestler, as one scholar humorously put it. Her action was considered a shameful act, and what's worse, the man could possibly be permanently injured and thus deprived of future children. At first blush, this passage apparently requires that a woman's hand be cut off if she seizes the genitals of a man fighting with her husband. Now, if this were the case, it would be the only biblical instance of punishment by mutilation. Beyond this, where ancient Near Eastern laws call for bodily mutilation for various offenses, the Mosaic Law does not call for bodily mutilation. Before we explore the text in more detail, we should compare this to other fearsome punishments in the ancient Near East. As we've seen, the Babylonian Hammurabi Code insisted that certain crimes be punished by cutting off the tongue, breast, hand, or ear, or the accused being dragged around a field by cattle. The law of Moses, though not ideal, presents a remarkable improvement when it comes to punishments. A more plausible interpretation of this passage is the punishment of depilation, or shaving. Is shaving, not mutilation. The word commonly translated hand can refer to the palm of the hand or some rounded concave object like a dish, bowl, spoon, or the arch of a foot. The commonly used word for hand isn't used here. It would be strange to cut off the palm of a hand. Furthermore, in certain places in the Old Testament, the word calf is clearly used for the pelvic area, either the concave hip socket or the curve of the woman's groin area. I arose to open for my lover, my hands dripped with myrrh and my fingers with flowing myrrh on the handles of the lock. That's Song of Solomon. This language alludes back to the locked garden. You are a locked garden, my sister, my bride. You're an enclosed spring, a sealed-up fountain. Scholars generally agree that the garden language is a metaphor for a woman's sexual organs, and its being locked implies her virginity. Also, in Deuteronomy 25, there's no indication of physical harm to the man, as some commentators commonly assume. For those who assume a literal hand-for-hand punishment, remember that the man's hand hasn't been injured or cut off. If so, then the idea of cutting off her hand would make slightly more sense. In addition, shaving hair, including pubic hair, as a humiliating punishment was practiced in Babylon and Sumer. This isn't mutilation for mutilation, but humiliation for humiliation. In addition, specific Hebrew cow verb has a milder connotation than the stronger intensified PL verb, meaning the cut off or physically sever. Whenever it appears in this milder form, it means to clip, cut, or shave hair. There's just no linguistic reason to translate the weaker verb form shave as a stronger form. In this particular case, we're talking about the open concave region of the groin, and thus a shaving of pubic hair. In short, the woman's punishment is public humiliation for publicly humiliating the man, something that's still very severe, for which no mercy was to be shown. From a textual point of view, the superior view is clearly the shaving view, not the mutilation view. Is this an ideal punishment for all time? Not at all. However, it does stand out in marked contrast to the severe and excessive mutilation punishments common in the ancient Near East. In fact, Middle Assyrian laws around 1100 BC present a similar scenario in the case of injury to the man, though with far more drastic consequences. If a woman in a quarrel injured a man's testicle, her finger was cut off. If the other testicle was injured, both her eyes were gouged out. Again, even if Deuteronomy 25 were dealing with an actual mutilation punishment, this would be the only such punishment in the Mosaic Law, and a dramatic contrast to the frequent mutilation punishments in the rest of the ancient Near East. But as we've seen, the language simply doesn't allow for this amputation rendering. Israel's laws were not perfect, to be sure, but when we compare Israel's laws with various ancient Near Eastern law codes, whether regarding sexuality or other matters, the general impression noted by scholars is a range of dramatic, even radical moral improvements in Israel. That is the end of chapter 11. Next time we'll look at chapter 12, where we will talk about slavery. Begin to talk about slavery. So, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider purchasing the published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist, where we look at the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. Please pray for this ministry, that God would send people to this page so that they can learn how to defend historic Christianity against divergent groups, including the New Atheists. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.